Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I'm Juliet Wade, and today we're talking about subconscious world building, and I have extra guests today, so I'm all very excited. Basically, I know that there aren't very many people who know me who actually say this, but I have seen this sprinkled around the internet, this belief that, well, I'm not world building, you know. And I think anybody who says I'm not world building is actually wrong. Hello. But I can see why people say that, because there's this general view that world building is the deliberate creation of secondary worlds, rather than it's the creation of a world on a page, right? Because a page doesn't have a world on it; it's just a page. And as Brian D says, every word is world building, and it doesn't matter if you're doing fiction or nonfiction, and it doesn't matter if you're doing, I mean, basically you're building a world on the page, and so you can't help yourself, really. So I wanted to talk about the kinds of things that constitute world building when we're not really thinking that we're world building. So to some extent, okay, so let's start with a couple of things. To some extent, every word is a world. Okay? Because every time you use a word, it comes with a whole raft of associations, right? The only time that you really don't have a whole bunch of associations with a word, and this is even like, I'm about to tell you why that's actually wrong, but let's say that you've made up your own word, okay? And you're like, nobody has ever in this history of the world seen this word before. And so you put it on the page. You're still going to be giving people a raft of information, right? And every piece of context that you add to that word brings even more. So every word suggests world, right? There are connotations to different words. Psycholinguistically, they say that every time we hear a word or read a word, it brings up every context in which we have ever heard the word ever in our lives, simultaneously, to varying degrees of strength depending on how many times we've heard the word in that particular context. Okay? So, yeah. Which means that there's really no way to put a word on a page without bringing things along. And even if you are in a situation where you're making up a word, that word is still going to have phonological associations, right? It's going to have a couple of things, really. So say you've put an alien word on a page. It does two things. It says, first of all, you are now in a context in which alien words are okay, which is something of a genre statement in and of itself, right? But also, then, in addition to that, you're going to have all kinds of associations with the phonological structure of the word, any words that this word should happen to resemble. Like, there's a reason why Voldemort was named Voldemort, and it was not random, right? And people interpret it differently, but I looked at that name the first time I saw it, and it was like, oh, wanting death.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, okay, it was a made-up word. I'd never seen it before, but I knew, right? And I knew that wasn't going to be nice.
On the end, too. I mean...
Yeah.
Of course, you can play with those expectations.
Absolutely.
You can use that to misdirect and mislead people.
Absolutely.
You can try having a hero, whose name sounds really horrible. It may be tricky, but certainly you can get away with it supporting characters. You can create an expectation in a reader in order to subvert that expectation.
Absolutely. So you can like red herring name your characters. Right? Look at this henchman here who has this horrible name. Oh, and he saves the day. Right? I mean, so...
And there's fine precedent for that. I mean, you can say it's cheating, but there's a fine precedent for that. I mean, who's the biggest guy in Robin Hood's Merry Men?
Little John.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The little is ironic. So, there's perfect precedent for doing that.
Right. And in fact, you can layer in things like irony and all kinds of stuff, because what you're doing is every time you put a word on a page, you're not putting it there by itself. And it's going to be set into a context, and then you can start playing with all the things, the contrasts between the context and the word itself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, there's no way to put words on a page without building a world, without betraying some kind of information. Every move you make as a writer is going to betray information about what you think is going on, because ideally, that's really what you should be doing, is letting people know what you think is going on in the story. However, okay, so we have, in the past on this show, I've talked about things like technology sets. Now, I don't know if you guys were around at the point when I was actually talking about technology sets, but let's talk about them for a second, because technology sets are super useful, and they can also be super frustrating, right? If they're basically if-then kinds of things. If I see electricity, I should be able to expect fill in the blank, right? So if you put electricity in a story, people will start expecting to see maybe not super advanced stuff like cell phone, but there will be other things, right? It depends on what context the electricity occurs in. Everything's about context here too. But in some sense, we have these historical periods that we reference by referring to things that appeared in them. So, so if I see a computer, I can expect to see a cell phone, right? If I see a gas lamp, then I can expect to see dirigibles, right? I mean, expectations get set up by history. They also get set up by genres themselves, right? How do you tell? I mean, so like, okay, imagine that you're given a book and you don't get to look at the cover, you just open to a random page. How are you going to tell whether it's science fiction or steampunk or historical fiction or all those kinds of things? What you're going to be doing to get clues to that world is you're going to be looking for clues on the page, right? And sometimes all it takes is one word to set the mood, right? One of the words that I see very often used, and it's very powerful, is king. The minute you see king, all kinds of expectations start coming into play, right? And so it is this sort of if-then kind of process, I think, where you say, if I see this word, then it means I will be able to expect this whole other set of things that come in the world surrounding kings, for example, right?
And that can unfortunately be really, really annoying as a writer, because
it's
in
really
a sense,
annoying.
You want to go into a particular direction, and you know that all your readers, having read X other fantasy books, whatever, they are going to think in that direction. You're going like, I don't want you to go in that direction. I want you over here.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating. As you know, that what most people know about medieval history, they know from fantasy novels. They don't know from studying medieval history.
Yep.
And all the fantasy novels are wrong.
Yep. Yep. Fantasy novels are wrong. Right? So yeah, and I think when I was in grad school, what we called this was schema. This idea that you have a whole you've got this whole sort of scenario that's going to come leaping into your head, like, you know, full-fledged Athena being born, kind of, you know, one or two words is enough to do it. And if you're not going to be matching those expectations, you really do have to work hard, and you have to work early, right? Because you only have this much time to set the expectations correctly, right? Before those expectations and those schemas become so strong in people's heads that they will then feel like you're betraying them if you depart from those, right?
If you're going to depart from those, then you need to show something that shows context, but shows that they should not be expecting something. Don't call it a king. You call it something else, and then they'll be. But make it clear. You have to make it clear that that is the head of the government, and there's, you know, an expectation that you might not know right off what the form of the government is.
Yep.
So, if it's almost a rabbit, if it takes the place of a rabbit, but it isn't, you might want to call it something else.
Right. So in fact, when we're talking, I don't think I've ever published a story in which I've used the word king. Right? I've published a story in which I've used the word majesty for a ruler, because I wanted to suggest a hereditary, basically dictatorship of sorts. I've also used the word eminence, but trying to be vague and trying to just the choice of the alternate word is a form of evidence that you want people to withhold their schemata for a period of time. Hey, bear with me here. You're looking at a leader, but you know, it's not necessarily the kind of leader that you wanted to, you know, that you would immediately imagine. Right. And sometimes, you know, I remember one time I was looking for the right word to talk about how, you know, one of my characters was grateful to another character for being nice to him, right? And I knew that the stuff that I was thinking was just wrong because it didn't have the right world that came with it, right? And when I finally hit on it, it was because it came from a world that shared a lot of features with the world that I was working in. And so the word that I wanted was indulgence, right? But indulgence comes with its own sort of links back to nobility, servants, and you know, these, you know, sort of, there's a very strong class-related set of associations that comes in with that word. So, yeah, all of that. Okay, so let's see. I'm seeing a bunch of stuff in the chat bar.
It's irrelevant.
You guys are having a side conversation.
Most of us just goofing off.
No,
Yeah.
not completely. There's you're talking about different words for rulers and so forth. Even then, you have a potential problem. If you say prince, most people will think, oh, there's a king and this is the king's son. But
Yeah.
prince was and has been in various countries and still is a ruler in their own right.
Right.
Monaco still has a prince. That's the ruler of Monaco.
Yeah.
So you've got to, this is a problem I have all the time. You're working against the weight of so many other writers, and you have to try and find ways that if you want to do things different from those other writers, you sometimes you can't use the language and the concepts and the motifs that everybody else uses, and then everyone goes like, well, what is this person talking about? They're just talking gibberish.
Yeah, right. And well, I've mentioned this a bunch of times in various contexts, but usually talking about defeating expectations. You have to kind of punch the expectations in the face early, sort of jog them loose a little bit. And so, when I'm writing Varan stories, I like to put electricity within the first paragraph, certainly within the first page, because so many features of Varan appear to be medieval that I have to make sure that I have electricity right up front so that you can see things that look medieval plus electricity, bam, in your face, and then you kind of go, wait, and then you're, then as a reader you're more ready to go, okay, well, I might see some things that I'm not expecting.
Generally, I'd agree with that, but there is one really famous example that actually goes totally against this and does it really pretty well, which is Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders. Because you read the first book of that and you think it's all, medieval and whatever, and it's only over time you kind of discover that this is actually a science fiction world. It's a lost colony, and there's all sorts of stuff lurking in the background. And that's actually done really well, because I think it was probably the third or fourth book that I realized what was going on.
Yeah, I know. I remember that happening too. And my brain went, what? But I think by that time I had already sort of given my faith to her.
That's the trick that she did. She did it well enough. I'm not a huge Anne McCaffrey fan, but she did the world building well enough that you trusted her so much that when these other things suddenly started appearing, you were like, well, that's interesting, instead of, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. You were like, I've been brought into this world for long enough. So it's the opposite. Instead of doing it too soon, she did it really, really late, so that you had this whole world that you trusted, you believed in, and then when things that didn't seem to fit were introduced, you went, well, I've been here so long, there must be a reason for that. It's an interesting mystery. I will follow the mystery.
Yeah. I will note, though, that she does have discussions of astronomy right at the beginning, right? When she talks about the star and the, like her little prologues are very scientific. And she does have a sort of a breadcrumb trail of, not... She doesn't talk about how the dragons came to be per se, but she does talk about, as a chemical explanation for why they would breathe fire, and you know what I'm saying. So, yeah.
Well, as far as the Anne McCaffrey example is concerned, when the science fiction elements became more prominent, that's actually, I've talked to a lot of people that's the point where they criticize the series. So it's certainly a bold choice.
Yep.
And it's not going to work for everybody, no matter how well you set it up if you put it that late.
Agreed. Yeah, there are always going to be. The trouble is, I think it happens in every series. You lose people along the way because no matter what you do, you're adding something, some element. It's a new character, it's a new event, or whatever. There's always going to be something that someone doesn't like, and you drop people at that point. Yeah. It's much harder to get new people in partway through a series than to lose your existing authors. There's a reason most series don't go on for very long. There are exceptions. World of Time went on for a very long time. But generally speaking, most series don't last more than a few books because it's really, really hard to keep that audience in.
Hi, Kimberly. Welcome.
Hi.
Awesome. I'm glad I can hear your voice.
Good.
Was just checking. So let's do the climate thing. I like Brian's all caps comment that not everything happens in the northern hemisphere of a world. Indeed, indeed. Do you guys have comments that you'd like to make about expectations vis-a-vis climate?
Well,
I think. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think for starters, sometimes it's easier to write what you already know, and if you're living in North America or something, you have all 4 seasons, and so you just go with there's winter, summer, spring, fall, etc., and you kind of just stick with that if you even reference weather or climate at all.
Right.
And some books often just have it.
Yes, and I'm seeing Brian remarking on the Star Wars tendency to put the single biome worlds everywhere.
Yes, the city planet even.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, it's not really feasible, but it's a good shorthand for things. But I think there's also I'd like to say that I think people have certain associations with weather, like that the North is going to be more technologically advanced, and if you have something like a tropical a tropical region, it's less advanced, and I think that comes from the European ideas of Europe versus Africa versus
that's your subconscious world building right there.
Yep. I was hoping we would go in this direction, so yes.
Yeah, no, it is. It's colonial assumptions. It's like, oh, people who live in deserts and jungles must be primitive because they're not us. It's like, that's rubbish.
It's like, oh, they're living in tents. How awful. We have to fix them.
Yeah.
Yeah. That might just be the right way of living in this region,
Yeah.
Never mind that.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But yeah, so our own history of colonialism has led to a lot of fantasy world expectations, definitely. About what kinds of climates come with advanced civilizations of various types. I'm not seeing a lot of Inca-inspired fantasy where things are very sophisticated but totally different from what we experience today.
Yeah, I want to write that. I want to write fantasy where people weave their way out of problems instead of forge their way out of problems.
Go for it, Brian. I want to read that.
That's what the Incas did. Their solution to everything was like, we can weave things, we can tie things together, we can make ropes and knots and stuff. So everything in their culture was based on that was their solution to a problem. You didn't use a hammer and a nail. You didn't use wood or iron. You used wool and grass.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Or stone.
Yeah, or stone, for sure.
But I mean, no, there are places where they had floating villages, floating gardens. I mean, the floating gardens are more Central American, but there were some on the lakes in Bolivia that they would actually, build entire floating villages out of reed, because it's like, well, we can, because that's what we've got. That's the materials to work. We don't have beasts of burden. We don't have anything that can pull a plow. We don't, we don't have anything we can ride on, and yet we can still do all of these fantastic technological things because we approach from a completely different mindset. And there is not enough of that.
Yeah. And I think, in fact, we have a very sort of well-worn path of expectations in terms of what constitutes technological advancement. But a technology doesn't have to be made of the same things that our technologies are made of in order to be very, very effective and in order to be really useful for quality of life. And so if you're thinking about it from a quality of life standpoint, you can actually get to similar quality of life in very, very different ways, depending on how you manage the whole thing. I mean, we're still finding out a ton about, you know, the way that Vikings lived and the way that the Etruscans lived, and you know, I mean, when I think about the kinds of things that were lost when the Roman civilization fell, that was
Concrete.
amazing, right? I mean, that was an incredibly advanced civilization that we
they had, like,
often feel like we know pretty well, but I suspect we don't know it as well as we think we do.
I heard they had special concrete that, like, people are trying to, like, how do you make that concrete anymore?
Yeah.
The concrete they had was basically a family trade secret. It was this one of the problems with a lot of ancient technology is it wasn't necessarily shared around the way we kind of expect to nowadays.
Yeah.
If it gave somebody a financial advantage, they damn well kept the secret.
Yeah.
And that was the case with Roman concrete.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think sod houses are a really good example. I mean, we seem to be moving back towards that, don't we? You know, using the earth to protect you from the elements. Gee, good idea.
The earth that's in place where you are, rather than necessarily transporting from some other place.
Right, right. Yeah, and local materials are going to vary widely.
Yeah, it's one of the problems of colonialism is if you only know how to do the thing that works at home and you come to a new environment and that thing doesn't work because you don't have the materials or the conditions are not conducive to that thing. And usually colonials just try and bluster through it anyway because they go like, oh, well, we're more advanced, we know best. And they don't adopt local building techniques or whatever, and they actually suffer horribly.
Yeah.
They do good things, you know.
Yeah, and you nearly starve, and you, right?
Absolutely.
But they just keep going, and like if you look at like the Americas, obviously, Europe, the Europeans, we managed to dominate despite just plowing onward with European systems and you know, and such. So it's like you can force it to work. And I think that's what a lot of people just sort of generally do. It's, you know, by God, you're going to get that square peg in that round hole. You know.
Yeah.
You know, and it doesn't matter what tools they take.
Hammer.
Do it.
Yeah. Yep. So. Yeah. So I'm trying to make sure that I'm not missing things in the chat bar. You guys, there's so many of you today that you're really challenging me, and I love you. I don't want to miss anything important here. Yeah. Well, so you know, you do have some things like Alia de Baudard's work, where she has spacefaring society based on Vietnamese and Chinese culture. Where you really see a different kind of cultural path and different kind of attitudes towards similar things, and things are arranged very differently. I mean, I think cultural expectations are incredibly strong, and these are some of the things that we can bring with us. And I think a lot of the cultural expectations that we bring with us are not the cultural expectations of our own lives, but of these well-worn fictional paths that we have trodden over the course of our lives. I'm going to actually, I think it's worth mentioning Aliette, who told me that she writes science fiction in English because all the science fiction she's read has been in English. And so science fiction just feels like it's in English on some level. I mean, I'm summarizing inelegantly, and I think you should definitely go check out what she has said on her website about it. But I think that's a very, very strong thing. So, you know, our history as readers of science fiction and fantasy really have a great deal of influence on what kinds of expectations we bring as writers to what we're creating. And so the more widely we can read and the more different kinds of things we can read, the better off we are in terms of freeing up those expectations and not having the world building that we do on the page just look like a subconscious retread of all the things that we've ever read. Sorry, I have to remember I'm taking notes here, so I don't. I've got to make sure my report doesn't miss anything important. You know.
Well, you know, Juliet, I have noticed something though, that you know there is this effect where the reader is imposing their own mindset on the story, and so even in cases where the author may have deliberately worked with climate or may have deliberately worked with a different setting, a lot of times you may find that readers are overriding that with their own preconception.
Yep.
As an example, Game of Thrones, right? We have the arguably the technologically advanced civilization is sort of right in the middle between the hot zone and the cold zone, right? It's not in the north, it's not in the south, but a lot of people still tend to presume that that's sort of a northern system.
Right.
I mean, just in the conversations that I've had about it, and in the conversations I've had with other readers, not necessarily authors, you know, or if you look at Tobias Buckle's Sly Mongoose stuff, people forget all the time that a big chunk of those stories start in the Caribbean areas, right? That those are that the language and the environments in chunks of those stories is all derived from a warmer climate, is derived from, you know, an island nation. But when you talk to people about it and you read commentary about it, people rewrite it in their heads.
Yep.
And so I have to wonder, as an author, how do you put that in strongly enough where it sticks? Right? Do you have to go over the top?
Well, you know what? It's I don't think that there's a single answer to that question, right? I think there are multiple answers to that question, and I just think it depends a great deal on who your reader is, right? Mm-hmm. You know, because some people are going to have a really easy time going, oh, there's a piece of evidence that I should change my worldview, right? I'm always looking for stuff like that, right? It's how I go into a story. I'm always like, okay, what are we doing here, you know? And I'm looking out for stuff like that. And a lot of people aren't looking out for stuff like that, but will see it if it's there.
Yeah.
And then there are people who won't see it until they've seen it about 3 times. Right? And then there are people, no matter how many times they see it, they've already overwritten it and too bad. Right? I mean, so I don't think there's a single answer to that, but I think the best you can probably do as an author is to make sure the evidence is there and that it's coming in multiple forms. Mm-hmm. And that it's coming often. Because really, honestly, cues to the environment are everywhere in the text. They're not just in what word you choose for the ruler. They're in the pronouns that you use. They're in the descriptions that you use. They're, you know, they hide everywhere. And so the more places you can be conscious of, right? The more you know, more places you can be conscious of as a writer, well, oh, I got to put, I could, if I did this, it would be really different. And if I did this, it would also show a difference. And it would, so the more places you can have it, the stronger the effect is going to be. And you can also use characters to do explicit kinds of explanations, right? I mean, you can say, I'm going to set this up where I have this world and I have this outsider character who's either human or isn't, right? And I'm going to take this outsider whose expectations are much more similar to my reader's expectations, and then you're going to watch them get really confused and have their own expectations flouted, and you're going to watch them explicitly going, wow, I really didn't know that, or whatever, right? So there are subtle methods of doing it, so it's just kind of available everywhere in the environment, or there are these more explicit ways of doing it. And when you read Ancillary Justice, Breck is not necessarily, I mean, she's not what I would call the typical outsider character, but she is an outsider to all the human-based Radkai societal things. And so she can get away with explaining how the manners work and explaining how this, that, and the other works. She can get away with explaining that, and she does it often, right? And she explains things multiple times. She often will explain the same thing at the when it comes up here, and then when it comes up here again, she'll mention something about how it's supposed to work, and set up these deliberate contrasts between expectations and reality, so that you can look at them and go, I must have my expectations properly set, etc. Right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, so all I'm saying is
there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Doing it, but they won't all necessarily work. I mean, because really, honestly, I mean, I've already mentioned this once before today, but every word we see is bringing up all the associations that we've ever had with it. But those associations come out of our own individual experience. So really what you're doing as a writer is you're not actually creating an experience on the page, you're evoking an experience on the page. Mm-hmm. Right? And what you're evoking is going to depend on what your reader is bringing to the table. Right? If they have never had this experience before, they're going to be like, what? Right? Or if they've had the experience 1,000 times and it's gone a really different way from the way it went when you experienced it, again, right? They'll be like, well, I don't see why it turned out that way, because that's not the way things turn out in the world, right? So yeah, I mean, and I think also it's important to point out that we can be as conscious and as explicit about our process of world building as we like, but we will never, ever, ever be able to get all the way to the bottom. We cannot be fully conscious of everything that we're putting on the page. And I don't think we necessarily should want to be, right?
Right.
Because, I mean, how many people here have written something where a person other than you read it and was like, wow, I really liked how you were bringing out this, this, and this, and this here, and you're like, well, I didn't really mean to do that, but I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this extra layer of meaning came out, and you were like, yeah, I meant to do that. Cool. I mean,
you can do as a living writer, your current work, but if you're looking at someone who was writing 50 or 100 years ago and they're not around to say, no, that is not what I meant at all, or,
right.
Oh yes, I meant to do that, which is one reason that I didn't major in lit studies, because that lack of support just made me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I imagine it could be frustrating if that meaning comes out to a reader and you not only didn't mean to do that, but you meant something entirely different.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. And I mean, I think part of one of the things that I find difficult when I'm working within my worlds is that I'm most of the time working with complete world insiders, right? And so I don't get to sort of sit back and commentate on how my world works for, like from an outsider's point of view. Particularly, I mean, okay, with my alien stories, usually I've got a human involved, and I can say, okay, well, they're going to have this kind of expectation, and then I can have them react, and they can be my vehicle for explaining things or puzzling about things and helping to guide readers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with stuff like Foreign World, everybody's an insider, and they may be outsiders to each other's subcultures, which usually they are. But at the same time, I have to go, as a writer, I have to go in and I have to say, okay, so who's this character? What subculture are they a part of? How does that set their expectations about, subculture B? How do you go to subculture B and say, how does that set their expectations about subcultures A and C? So these things are very, very challenging. And I'm always finding another wrinkle. Or wow, this person's reaction came across as really weird and wrong, and I don't know why. And then when I go back and I start really sort of needling through the underpinnings culturally in terms of what I've already set up, I think, my world Bible would probably be like that thick. But anyway, then I go, oh, right, I missed this whole thing about how these people view these people and blah, 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 blah. And so the reaction would have to be something else. All right, and not what it was that I had them doing, which, I still find myself reacting as an Earth human, and I'm going, oh shoot, you're not an Earth human now, you're a, stop doing that. So yeah, I mean, oh, and I mean, we haven't even mentioned this, though we did mention colonialism, but I think that it's worth mentioning this explicitly is our racial expectations, and how that has to do, and like how that influences the way we even talk about colors and what people look like, and subconscious judgment calls that come with various things like that. I mean, I don't think I'm a firm believer in the fact that people, know that they're not supposed to be racist, but the stuff that hides in our understanding of world structures and then sneaks out in various ways can be very tricky to identify and defeat when we're working in a different world context. So, do we want to try to negate that? Do we want to reverse it? Do we want to just sort of try to make sure that it doesn't happen? Somebody's yeah. So like when you have a set of expectations that you want to interact with, in a sense, it's very helpful to be able to make deliberate decisions about those expectations. So, yeah, and I tend to sort of personally not want to play out biases that happen in the world as is. I tend to want to sort of mess around with them and make them fit the world that I am working in. So, it's almost like rederiving something, right? The other day I talked about how I had rederived days of the week, right? Because I wanted to have weeks, and I wanted them to behave in a particular way, right? Where you had a 7-day week and a 2-day weekend. But I didn't want it to be for the same reasons that we have a 7-day week and a 2-day weekend. So I completely went into the mythology of the world, you know, and said, okay, so we've got, 7 deities, and 2 of them are lovers, and weekends are for lovers. Right. So rederiving things in an alternate way to make them look as familiar or as unfamiliar as we want them to, is something that you can play around with. But like, so for example, I've kind of rederived misogyny in the Varan world, because the nobles are incredibly misogynist. But it's because they're a shrinking group, and they're having fewer children, and they're in a sort of general panic, and their caste is closed, and they don't have any way of introducing new DNA, and so the choice that the guys have made is to blame it all on the women and try to quote unquote protect them, and by turning them into baby making machines and putting them under tons of pressure. But if you look outside of that particular group, that demographic pressure is not there, and so the misogyny does not work in the same way. There's far less of it. In fact, the rest of the castes are much more egalitarian. So, yeah, I guess, so you can defeat the expected, or you can rederive the expected and play with it in another way, I guess, is what I'm saying. If you're doing it on purpose. Right. So. More note writing over here.
Well, and another example of what you're talking about with, you're including something that's kind of ugly in society that we have now, but you're reframing it, you're rederiving it. Another example, like Brandon Sanderson in his King, he's including prejudice in his people.
Yep.
It's it's based on eye color, like if light eyes or dark eyes, and it's none of us want to actually have that kind of prejudice based on something so trivial, but it's something that's prevalent in society, and so it's something that he kept in his story, and it gives it kind of a reality to it in that world building. So it's
right. I mean, it's also taking the basis for it and changing it up so that we have an opportunity to re-examine it in a sense and say, wow, this is really arbitrary, right? And hopefully that would reflect back on our own experience and help us to say, wow, gee, our own feelings about this are really arbitrary, right? So yeah, so those are valuable things to do. And Brian's telling us about how weekends are so modern. Yes, in our world they are very modern.
Leisure time did not used to be something that you'd have 2 days of at a time. Leisure time, you might have 5 minutes, you might have an evening, you might have 6 months. It depends entirely on what your local agriculture and workloads and so forth are.
Yeah.
If you're a Viking, you have 4 to 5 months when you can't do any farming or anything else.
Right.
It's horrible outside, and you sit around in your longhouse and you tell stories, which is why they have such a huge oral tradition.
Yeah.
If you're working in Egypt, your farming is entirely dictated by the 2 floods of the Nile.
Yep.
And when they're not flooding and when there's nothing you can do in the fields because they're lying fallow and you're waiting for the next water to come in, you build pyramids because you have time. You have a large number of people who have nothing else to do, and you can go like, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make those build a pyramid. That's how these things happen. People think, oh, there's no way they would have had time to do all those pyramids. People would use as much time as they needed to grow food, but there are many environments where you can't spend all of your time raising food. You can mostly do it in sort of, southern Central Europe kind of thing a bit. But in most places, there are actually times when you can't work on providing food. Even though 90% of people have to work when they possibly can to provide enough food for the society, there are times when they can't do that. And what do you do with all those people when they can't actually be producing food? They have to find something to do. If there's a large population, and there was in Egypt, you build stuff. You've got all the materials you need. You go like, let's build a pyramid. Let's store some grain in it, or whatever it is that they were for.
Right.
Is that not a thing? I don't know.
No,
Well, you'd
it
need
totally
someplace
is,
to store the grain that you could only grow in particular seasons. Right?
Yeah.
Likewise,
Well,
you have to
That is,
accept
to be, there's nothing wrong. There's a fine tradition of big fortified granaries in some parts of the world, including around there. But you have to say that the pyramid is probably the thickest walled granary I have ever come across. It's it's over-engineered, it's safe to say.
Yeah. No, but I think that's a really good point. And in fact, it reflects back on our discussion of the other day when we were talking about food.
Yeah,
which
I
is
missed that.
fun, it depending on what the nature of your food production is, it's going to change your. I mean, why do we have summer vacation from school? It's because kids had to help in the fields.
Yep.
Right.
Harvest time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
everyone has to go out and harvest when the stuff is ready. Yes.
Yep.
There's things, all these sorts of things that we don't think about that are driven by how people, used to live, and when they didn't have the same level of ability to affect their environment that we do. I mean, when people were first raising animals, on a small scale, when you don't have industrial farming, you have to raise animals in time with the seasons and in time with the food that's available for the animals.
Right.
A lot of people don't understand the origins of veal. This is one thing that people crop up and they talk about how cruel veal crates and so forth are. Veal crates are cruel. They're horrible things. But they're trying to simulate what actually happened in alpine climates where the snow comes down, your cows can't forage. Most houses in Switzerland, farmhouses in Switzerland and Austria and those areas are built so that the ground floor is for the animals and people live further up. Because for 6 months of the year, 4 or 5 months of the year, the animals are living in there. They have to because they can't forage anywhere else. You can only keep enough alive that for the amount of hay that you've managed to harvest throughout the year. So you've had to work real hard in summer to make sure you grow enough grass and cut enough hay, but you slaughter most of your animals in fall, in autumn. That's when you make loads of sausages. That's why sausages are such a big thing in Central Europe. You keep maybe one breeding bull in the vicinity, and you'll have some agreement with other farmers. One person will keep the bull to breed again next year. You keep all your cows pregnant at that point. The cows give birth before they can actually get out and forage. So the calves, for the first 5 or 6 weeks, grow up indoors in the dark, being fed their mother's milk and hay. That's all they've got available. That's how veal happened. And then when you let them out, some of them you kill because you've run out of meat over winter, and some of them, depending how much forage available you've got, you let forage and you continue the herd going. And that's how farming works when you don't have industrial scale factory farming.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. Morgan said in the thing that the prevalence of pork in places is because pigs are easier to feed because they'll eat absolutely anything. They'll eat slops and so forth. So they are a year-round food supply. They'll eat people. Do not, fall over in a pen of hungry pigs.
Yeah.
There will be nothing left. They will destroy you.
Yeah, there was a news story about something like that.
There was a pig farmer in California. This is only a few weeks ago that happened to.
Don't do it.
Seriously. This is not an uncommon thing. Pigs are pretty much omnivores. If you've seen the dentition on wild pigs, you'll know what I mean.
Oh yeah, I have a small boar skull in my very small skull collection.
I was actually just reading a news story.
Is that a small collection of skulls or a collection of small skulls?
Both. A small collection of small skulls.
I was
Fair
just
enough.
reading an article the other day that had me absolutely wide-eyed from one end of it to the other, and it was about the incredible overpopulation of radioactive wild boars in the Fukushima exclusion zone.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one.
And there are so many of them that they can't actually kill them and bury them effectively. And they can't eat them because they're radioactive. And I'm going,
I, for one, welcome our radioactive wild boar overlords.
They can join the Chernobyl group.
oh my gosh. Well, anyway, so guys, this has been super fun, but it's 11:04.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to have to stop the broadcast. Next week, we're going to have a really terrific author guest, and he's going to be here on Wednesday, and I have to remember what time. Let me just see if I can quickly bring up the time so that I can not make stuff up in front of you. Here we go.
Are you going to tell us who it is as well?
It's Randy Henderson. He's the author of Fin Fancy Necromancy.
Yep.
And so that's going to be awesome. It's going to be 11 o'clock. So at this time, next Wednesday, the 20th.
Okay.
And so that's going to be really awesome because, as he remarked when I spoke to him about coming, that we haven't really talked much about urban fantasy on the show. A lot of this is about secondary world building, and I think it would be a great time for us to branch out and learn a bit about Randy and his work. So that'll be really fun. That will be next Wednesday at 11 o'clock in the morning, and I hope you can make it. And I will stop the broadcast.